of Ideas, and to this, the first discussion of the morning and of the weekend, Women versus Feminism, do we all need liberating from the gender wars? My name's Sally Millard and I'll be chairing this first discussion. I'm a member of the Battle of Ideas Organising Committee and a founder of the Institute of Ideas Parents Forum, which is sponsoring this particular session. I'm really pleased and excited to be joined by such a fantastic panel of speakers that I have here with me today. I think if you look at, since I first proposed this session to the Battle of Ideas Organising Committee, things have moved on considerably. At that time, the thing that was dominating the media was Trump and his pussy hats. Now we don't really seem to see so much of that anymore, but every single week, every single day, there seems to be some discussion, whether that's the pay gap, whether that's abortion, girls' education, rape culture, and of course now dominating the headlines we've had Harvey Weinstein and his misdemeanor, shall we say, and the Me Too response. In many ways, I feel like that this debate is both more timely and more important and more necessary than it was even when I first conceived of it. Each of my panellists, as I say, will speak for 5 to 6 minutes, and as I say, if you've got any questions, there will be plenty of time afterwards to ask them. I'm going to introduce the panel in the order in which they will speak. Dr. Joanna Williams is going to be speaking first. She has provided the inspiration for this session. She's the author of Women versus Feminism, Do We All Need Liberating from the Gender Wars? And what a brilliant book it is, so I do really recommend it to you if you haven't had a chance to read it yet. As well as provoking debate on this discussion, she's well known for provoking debate on education as the education editor for the online magazine Spiked. So she'll be speaking first. Next, I have Dame Helena Morissey. She's the head of personal investing, legal and general investment management, founder of the 30% Club, and author of the forthcoming book, A Good Time to Be a Girl, Don't Lean In, Change the System. And that is due out in February, so make sure you keep a lookout for that. Following Helena, Eszter Kovats will be speaking. She's a political scientist from Budapest who writes and comments regularly on the use of gender in current political battles in Europe, and her forthcoming book, The Future of the European Union, Feminist Perspectives from East Central Europe, will be available in November. And then, last but definitely not least, Professor Alison Wolfe. Professor, the Baroness Wolfe of Dulwich, is a crossbench peer and author of The XX Factor, How the Rise of Working Women Has Created a Far Less Equal World. And that is a book that I would also highly recommend. It's a really interesting read. So without further ado, Joanna.
Thank you. In the light of the revelations we've been bombarded with over the course of the past couple of weeks, we've had news stories detailing how to be a woman today is to face a daily barrage of sexual harassment. And there's no sign at all of this ending. We now have women who work in Parliament using a secret WhatsApp group to line up male MPs who are, and I quote, very handsy or not safe in a taxi. These MPs are being lined up for public shamings. A survey out earlier this week claimed that half of British women have been sexually harassed at work. It seems as if feminism has never been more badly needed. It seems as if to be a woman is to live through hell. But drill down into these statistics and we discover that more than a quarter of the respondents to the BBC survey said that the harassment they had suffered was in the form of inappropriate jokes or banter. It seems to me that what we have is ever broader definitions of sexual harassment, and at the same time more women interpreting experiences that might once have been seen as part and parcel of office life, perhaps dare I say it, even fun, jokes, banter, and flirting. People are now interpreting this as harassment. Now, I want to make clear that my aim is not to trivialise sexual harassment or sexual assault in any way whatsoever. Serious offences need to be dealt with severely, preferably in courts of law rather than in the court of social media. But when sexual harassment is defined so broadly as to encompass jokes and banter, it begins to lose all meaning. Serious offences are then trivialised. Sexual harassment ends up being nothing more than a catch-all term that allows every woman to be included in a victim narrative. And that's what really intrigues me, and that's in a way the focus of my book. Why is it that so many women are keen to be included in a narrative of victimhood? And the message today does seem to be coming at us from every direction that women are victims. If someone makes an inappropriate joke in our earshot, we tremble, we faint at the merest whiff of sexism. When we have the misfortune to meet someone lecherous, we can't tell them where to go or give them a slap, but we must take to social media to cry, "Me too." Like children, we need protecting from nasty men and bad words. Victim feminism clearly does not represent all women. Most of the women I know are actually far too busy to stress about manspreading, let alone go and tweet about it. But this dominant narrative that women are victims is rarely challenged or put into context. When we look purely at statistics, there's never been a better time to be female. That girls do better at school than boys is common knowledge now, whereas 55% of young women go to university, only 43% of young men follow a similar route, and that's quite a substantial difference. But women's success doesn't end when they leave education. More women are in work than ever before and are also taking more of the top jobs. A majority of vets, doctors and lawyers are now women. Women are also earning more. The gender pay gap, however it is measured, is the smallest it's ever been. In their 20s, women earn more than men, and when we compare like-for-like pay, the pay gap almost disappears entirely. But society, these changes have happened so quickly that we've lost sight of the real barriers women once faced. So in the 1970s, fewer women worked, and those that did were relegated to poorly paid and often insecure jobs. And I think this is a really important point because I think sexual harassment was a real problem. I think it still is a real problem for some people. I think it really was a problem when women's low status in the labour market could be exploited by unscrupulous bosses, safe in the knowledge that those wanting to keep their jobs had little option other than to put up with these unwanted advances. But the more powerful women become in work, the more women begin to dominate different employment sectors. Women are not in that insecure position anymore where these unscrupulous bosses can take advantage for the most part. And it's thanks in large part to the efforts of a previous generation of feminist campaigners that young women today have a world full of opportunities available to them. And we should be celebrating this. And instead, my concern is that feminism tells young women now of new problems that they face, such as manspreading on public transport or mansplaining colleagues. This is not to suggest that everything's wonderful for women today, particularly when they become mothers. I think women face new pressures in trying to combine work with being a kind of textbook perfect parent. But the difficulties women still face are rarely the stuff of feminist campaigns. And I think they're often better solved by men and women working together rather than in opposition to each other. And a feminism that insists women are vulnerable and that men are toxic makes it less likely that men and women will come together to work to solve the problems that they face. My concern is that victim feminism resuscitates some really antiquated practices that we would not want to go back to. So over the past couple of weeks, a Friends star, David Schwimmer, has been praised for offering a female film critic a chaperone when they went off to discuss his film. Women students now were routinely advised not to leave nightclubs with strangers. Some reports suggest that men are nervous when interacting with women at work and fear that friendliness will be misinterpreted. My concern is that the fear of sexual harassment, far more than the reality, is now holding women back. And it's feminism today that's at the forefront of propagating these fears. Campaigners now call for new measures to protect women at work. But for me, the thought of spending the best part of each day somewhere where jokes are banned, flirtation needs a special permission slip, and banter is strictly forbidden, frankly makes me lose the will to live. The protections that victim feminism demands infantilise women and turn the clock back on hard-won freedoms. The liberty to risk unwanted sexual advances, I think, needs fighting for once more, because the alternative, a world of chaperones, curfews, single-sex workplaces, of women being kept chaste until handed from father to husband, is not that far behind us, and it's not one I have any desire to return to. And if we're to avoid confining young women nowadays to a self-imposed safe space, we need to think more critically about the direction feminism is taking us in.
Thank you.
So that's easy one for me to follow because, like Joanna, I also see, and obviously it's the title of my book, that for many of us at least, it's never been a better time to be a girl. We have made considerable progress. I've been working right here in the City of London for exactly 30 years this month, and I would characterise that set of experiences. The first decade was one where there was a hostile environment to women, where sexual harassment and sexual discrimination was very prevalent, and no one really did anything about it. The second decade, I think, it was a realization that, at least even if you didn't believe that we should be equal opportunities employers then, that wasn't the right way to behave, and that the law was protecting women more. So I guess I'd characterize that as the decade where we were tolerated. But there wasn't really a sense that we brought anything new to the table. And then since the financial crisis, that unleashed a different way of thinking about the issue, certainly on the part of many men. And I want to pick up on the point that Joanna's made, because I think at that stage, and again, not overnight and not every man suddenly realized that, having just one type of person running the show wasn't the best way of operating, and it was a very risky environment, and you did, even if you weren't naturally a feminist as a man, then you might start to welcome diversity and inclusion. And we saw a big wave of efforts, some of which I've led myself, so that was around the time that it set up the 30% Club, which has really been about men and women working together to effect change. I suddenly realized that in my own efforts before then, which weren't terribly successful around promoting women in the workplace, that actually women talking to women about women's issues was never going to get us very far. But actually the stroke of luck, and it was luck rather than being really clearly thought through in my mind, by involving the leaders of big British businesses at the time to not just support a campaign to get more women in the boardroom and at all leadership levels ultimately in their organizations, but to actually drive the campaign, to be the members of the 30% Club. So the members are the chairman of big businesses, the top 100, the top 250 as well, companies. It now has broadened to public sector organizations as well. But when we started, 99 of those 100 chairmen were men. We had to get them on board, and it wasn't always easy. There was some of them were very antagonistic, certainly towards me. But as they realized and as they saw this wave of change, as they realized that actually this was part of having a modern business, then they became some of the most avid supporters and have actually done something about it. Now, like Joanna, I share some concerns. I don't want to give the impression that it's all solved. And I think that we can look at something like the Me Too campaign and interpret it in quite a number of different ways. On one hand, we can say, after decades of very little even discussion, very little exposure about what's clearly been a rife problem, a corrupt sort of system in Hollywood, and then now much more aware of broader sectors, suddenly, through social media, then the world has changed, and we have a collective power, we have a collective voice. And that is, to use Joanna's word, something to celebrate. We can change things together. But also, it shows us that campaign, as many of you I'm sure are aware, wasn't set up by, white, wealthy, famous actresses in Hollywood, but by a black activist, Tarana Burke, who had a little girl, a 13-year-old, tell her about how she was sexually abused in 1997. And about a decade later, when she had the means, set up the first Me Too campaign. And Tarana Burke is black activist, and in that community it didn't go viral. It didn't get huge support. And I think it's a really strong reminder to us that it's not just one group, it's not just white middle class women that we need to be looking out for, but around everybody, and how we need to still do a lot of work to improve the sort of what's described the intersectionality point. I also think that we can see that it would be very easy now, and again, sort of picking up on some points that Joanna's raised, to go backwards, to wallow, frankly, in what's really happened, and we cannot change that. We cannot change the past, but we can influence the future. I feel it's a bit of a shame that we did not have a man up here with us. And I wanted to sort of have a ghost voice, really, not really a dead voice, I hasten to add, but my eldest son has contributed to my book, all my children have, and he, I think, really wonderfully summarized it. It was before the Harvey Weinstein scandal broke, but he suggested, and he's at university still, he is an educated man, and I know Alison will pick up on how our efforts around women may have inadvertently left other groups behind. But he said, I feel girls of my generation tend to have one of two quite differing positions about their futures. Most of the girls I know are confident and behave as if they don't see any barriers to what they hope to achieve in life. And they have done as well academically, if not better, than their male peers. And I also hope and think that men of my generation, he's 25 years old, have more enlightened views towards women than previous generation, and that's recognized by these women. And I do think that most girls don't in any way feel that men are preventing them from getting where they want to. But there is another group with a victimhood complex who push that narrative. These are women on the lookout for offense, and they wouldn't want to recognize the positive progress. They are a small but vocal minority, and the quieter group who are focused on their future, on making the most of the opportunity ahead, may get drowned out by the minority that I think is growing. Thank you.
If you have a Hungarian in the panel, you can always trust that the more pessimistic views will come. So that's why I came. First, to say why British debates are relevant in Hungary. And if the Daily Mail publishes an article that the British Medical Association issues a booklet that expectant mothers shouldn't be called expectant mothers anymore, but pregnant people, you can be sure that one day later, all the Hungarian right-wing press writes, oh, look what the West has become. If we deal with gender equality, this is a Trojan horse. Let's just not speak about violence against women. We will just, in a third or fourth step, we arrive where those British are at the moment, and we will have to speak like this. Or if the Guardian writes an article about the upcoming Swedish festival where only non-men are allowed to participate, then you can be sure that it is translated into Hungarian non-man. So please know that you have a responsibility. So if you speak about body shaming and manspreading and all these very important issues, then it will appear somehow in the name of progress in Hungary, and then the right wing will argue that that's why we don't need to do anything against inequalities, because it is a first step towards this on this slippery slope. When I hear such sentences like, it has never been a better time for being a girl than now, or women have more opportunities than ever, partly I would agree, partly no. We also have to see where and in which sense. So how many MPs are in the Hungarian parliament? There's only 10% of all MPs who are women. This is the lowest level on the EU, and also the discourse about women in public office reflects this number. But also in countries where it's much better, maybe sometimes we need to look behind those numbers. In Spain, in one of Zapatero's governments, there were 16 ministers, 8 men, 8 women. And the 8 men had 20 children, the 8 women 5. So, and if we just see, oh, there is parity, gender parity, we have equality in the office, then we would say, okay, we achieved equality. But if we see what is the price, what kind of women can move forward, then maybe we get a more nuanced picture. So either these are women who postpone their childbearing, or they just choose not to have children, or they rely on domestic workers if there's no infrastructure for care available or not enough. So I think if the question is there still a role for feminism today, then I would definitely agree that there is, and I would definitely agree that this victimhood narrative, what you are criticizing, should be overcome, but this optimism of, oh, we have nothing left to do, or we just have to work together to fine-tune the remaining inequalities, it might not be enough in this time. And for me, the crucial word is care, and what we do with the fact that human existence has this aspect of life, and economy and political life somehow excludes it or treats it as free, and it renews itself without doing anything. So caring for children, caring for sick, caring for elderly. I read regularly articles even about Great Britain, how this pressure on the is growing with that we live longer, that we need care for longer, and then the generation between 40 and 55 has to care not only for the children but for the elderly. And so that's why I'm really unhappy when, for instance, Hungarian feminists regularly write that men should finally come to the point that they change diapers and they should take their fair share in care responsibilities. But it's not only about men being nice enough and changing their attitudes, but it's also the way how we think about work and care and their relation in society and at the labor market. So as long as there is this idea about the reliable employee, the ideal employee who has no care responsibilities, who is available, and that women are discriminated against because they, at any point, they can get a child, they already have a child, they have a parent to care for, it's not only about their, being able to, for time management and having a nice husband. It makes it also for men much more difficult to take up more care. So this is, I think, the kind of feminism what we need. Thank you.
So I would like to start by showing you the front page of last week's Financial Times. And Financial Times is the newspaper of the global elite, not just the British elite, but the global elite. What is on every central banker's desk in the morning? The Financial Times. And a week ago, the FT thought that the most important story in the world was Weinstein board members claim lawyers hindered sex inquiry. Now, this was in a world where Spain was starting to break up, where Brexit negotiations were in trouble, where Trump was creating a revolution across Washington for good, bad, wherever you stand, where there had just been a major change in the nature of China, possibility of genocide in Myanmar. I mean, you name it. And for the FT, Weinstein board members claim lawyers hindered sex inquiry was the most important story. Why? And why the FT and not the other British papers that day? Because they didn't lead on that, interestingly. They led on motorway misery to end, have the police lost the plot, killer storm. The Eye, bless it, said Brexit talks will start in December. And the Sun had a different sex story. So why? I mean, was the FT basically following the great Sun insight that if you run stories about sex scandals, you get to run pictures of sexy girls? Well, no, it wasn't. It actually had a really boring picture, too. But I think the important thing about that is it actually shows that there has been a major shift in power. Because when victims and their victimhood, real or otherwise, are all over the front page, what that act of a very important paper, what that actually says to you is that that group may consider themselves to be victims, but they are now powerful, truly powerful, in a way that they have never been before. Because when people are powerless and they are badly treated and victimized, it doesn't go on the front page of the most elite newspaper in a country. So it seems to me that one of the things that's really sort of interesting, as well as, I agree with Joanna, just distressing about the current turn that gender relations have taken, is that it is indeed a victimhood story, but it's coming from people who actually are, in fact, far more powerful, namely women, and I would say here, well-off women, than they have ever been before. And I don't want to go into the Weinstein story in any particular detail. I did actually Google it again to see what some of the complaints were, and it was kind of, some of them are kind of ridiculous, I have to say. But the point is not whether there are some people who have been behaving very badly, but why is this a global story? And I would say it's a global story because women are more powerful. Some women are more powerful than they have ever been in history. So women do now head many corporations. They are a very important high-income demographic in their own right. They are a large majority of university students. In just about every country in the Western world, they're now a large majority of medical and legal students in our universities. And yet, they are defining themselves, this group, or some of this group, are defining themselves as victims who must be given special treatment. And I think that is, at one level, curious, but at another level, you could say that human beings always use the weapons that they have at their disposal to further their own ends, and that it might be quite a good idea to take a slightly Marxist view of this whole affair. I do agree that there are major problems for women, but I think this goes beyond being a sort of first world problem. I mean, as somebody who does use Twitter, this is such a Twitter phenomenon which itself tells you something about the class basis. And I kind of thought starting something which says #not me was a bit pathetic. But this is really an elite female whinge. And I think that we need to treat it as an elite female whinge and really worry about the harm that it can do in that respect. I've always thought it would be great to have Helen on my side if I wanted to run a campaign, because she has done a fantastic job. But I do have to say, and she sort of already knows this, that I don't think this is the biggest issue in the world, and I don't think that just having more women on a board creates diversity, because it depends where they come from. To me, the biggest problem in the world, and that's why I'm actually both angry and distressed by the turn that feminism has taken in the West, is not whether or not we have won and are winning the battle for women to have equal opportunities in the labour market, but the fact that inequality among women is increasing faster than among men. And it is doing so because the elite, as I think many people in this room will be aware, is pulling away. It's not just the top 1%, it's the top 15 to 20%, which has done really much, much better than everybody else. And one of the ways in which this happens is because the elite has managed to preserve strong families, and indeed to make them stronger than ever before, because your average elite family now has 2 networked people. 2 careers. Yes, it's hard to do it, but for example, in the UK, we now spend enormously much more on childcare than we did 20 years ago. We've gone from being bottom of the OECD to being almost top. But one of the things that's interesting is that we do it in a way that funnels the most money to professional and middle-class women in a way that suits their work patterns, and seem to be unable or unwilling to even grapple with how that would be best used to make it possible for a very different group of women. Women who don't earn a lot, women who are much more likely to become single mothers, heads of single-parent families, than graduate women are, let alone all graduate men. And what worries me very much about our societies is that what I've, in a couple of things I've written, called the super family, is now becoming so markedly different. So we've got a huge proportion of women to whom, quite reasonably, a killer storm is more important than Harvey Weinstein board members. And yet, the most educated, most networked, most eloquent women of our time are far too often obsessed with, I would say, using their own victimhood for their own ends. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I know some of the panellists already want to come back on other speakers, so we're going to have a lively debate. But before I bring them in, I just want to take a couple of points or questions from you first.
I think the problem with feminism that no one actually discusses that much is pop feminism, as it's called, or sort of companies like BuzzFeed and companies like Fuck Hate profiting off feminism. And I think that a lot of people sadly don't blame this and instead just blame young women who are quite impressionable. I think the problem is that these companies, they sell these products to very young women and they grow up thinking that's how they need to live. And these things perpetuate, of course, victimhood. And when these perpetuate the whole concept of women being very weak and needy, they sort of turn to these bigger corporations because they think, oh, they're standing up for women, they're going to help us, when they're not. And it's actually cringy watching a lot of these things because they do perpetuate the whole stereotype that women are extremely weak and need constant protection and coddling. And again, like, I think in year 9, we were doing a sector on feminism for English, and we were shown adverts, and one of the adverts was a Coca-Cola advert from the 1950s, and it was a woman talking about how she was drinking Coca-Cola to get her slimmer for her husband. And even though everyone was like, oh, that's sexist, that's appalling. Yes, it is sexist, but the point is that there's not a load of people sitting in an office thinking, oh, let's make this sexist advert against women. There's a load of people sitting in an office thinking, let's profit off women, and let's profit off impressionable human beings.
Okay, thank you very much.
So, right, first I'd like to say I just think the whole gender issue is a common sense issue, basically, and all these men that feel like scared to talk to women in offices and stuff like that is just, that's their problem and not society's, I think. If they're not comfortable knowing what is right and what is wrong to say to a woman, then maybe they shouldn't be around women. 2, have we really come this far if we've got a bigot like Trump is one of the most powerful people in the world? Have we really done much to balance things out? That's it.
Steve Mox, author of The Woman Racket and Sex Difference Explained. Feminism's always been inegalitarian, it's always been elitist, separatist. Wollstonecraft, upper class, didn't understand that all the laws to do with custody, marriage and divorce were all set up to benefit the majority of women, didn't happen to benefit her. All the suffragists, they wanted to bring an educational qualification. They didn't want most people to have the vote, and they were upper class and middle class. Third wave feminism, so-called, that's the core of identity politics. That dates back 100 years. That's the left backlash against the mass of us for not rising up as the Russians did. So feminism has always been elitist, separatist, and egalitarianism. And the problem is, if you look at the roots of what is at root, the difference between men and women, my interest is looking at the biological roots, and the idea that women are disadvantaged is ludicrous. Women are privileged. The disadvantaged group in all societies, in all points of history, is in the mass of the lower status males. This is a reality that's never going to change.
I actually think it is a very big systemic issue. It's already in the way we talk about it. When we say, with regards to your victimhood comment, and many that's been made, like when a woman is attacked or harassed, we say the woman was attacked or harassed. It's a very passive statement. It's never the man attacked the woman. It's never the man harassed the woman. It's always the woman was attacked. So the question is, and also I think this is a very cultural in that different European countries, different countries from across the world, like where I come from, or Japan, we have a very different approach to gender dynamics, and it's also generational, as you've mentioned. So I guess the question is, like, how do we go about changing that passive statement of a woman was harassed, or a woman was attacked, or they were offended, or whatever, to the man was attacked the woman, or or he made a bad comment or an inappropriate comment. How do we go about changing the way we frame and we talk about the way this gender dynamic unravels in society?
Thank you very much. Some really great questions and comments coming out. So I'm going to take Helena to come back first.
But I did want to come back and agree with Alison on the fact that I don't think women on boards is the biggest issue either. What I would like to think happened with that, and it's part of this bigger discussion, is that we kind of open the lid on one part of what is obviously a much broader issue, yes, about sort of the identity of people who are in leadership roles, but more generally about how we get more ideas, more leadership from other people. It was a very cozy club of people who all knew each other, who were getting on boards and so forth. And what we have now is not necessarily lots more women always coming on. It's only going to be a few women anyway. This is not going to be enough to affect the hundreds of thousands, millions of women that we really all care about. But also people saying, actually, we don't have enough ethnicity on our boards, we don't have enough socioeconomic breadth, we're out of touch as businesses and as governments. I think the point, there was a point briefly, and I know it'll be dangerous to get onto it, about Trump, but actually I think that shows the need for new thinking, and we've seen it in the political shocks. We will continue to see that in, with the whole Catalonia. I think it's horrific what's happening there in terms of the pushback by what feels like a totalitarian regime, like in terms of you can't speak up. And I know there's developments overnight on that, or over the last 24 hours. But the idea is we have now transparency in our world. Leaders cannot just have the right to lead without earning the credibility and without engaging with people. And like him or hate him, Donald Trump engaged with a certain group of Americans who did not feel that anyone had listened to them before. And Hillary Clinton, for a lot of people, came across as very elitist. So it isn't just as straightforward as saying one's sexist, one's representing huge gender elite forward. I think we need to enter a more nuanced phase of our discussion. And the last point I'd like to say before handing over to others, because I think several people have said, how do we change the narrative? How do we change the way we talk about these issues so it's not as victim or assaulter, that it's actually much more nuanced. I think what we're trying to do now is take advantage of what I think is a one-off, never been seen before chance that the internet has given us for us to have a much less patriarchal, much less hierarchical, much less command and control system of power. That is hugely impactful for all of us in this room, whatever our gender, whatever our status, whatever our educational background. It's not easy, and there'll be huge, dislocations, and that's what I think this whole Harvey Weinstein example is very, both distressing and informative, that it shows how when something really stands out as unacceptable, then something can be done about it now it couldn't before. So I had that optimism. I understand where Eszter's coming from. I'm not claiming it's all solved, but we can all make a difference here.
Thank you. I think the point that Eszter was making and that Alison was making, and has come out of the audience here, that the experiences of different women are very different, is a really important one. So Eszter was mentioning different countries have been mentioned there as well. I would add to that generation. I think, 1992 was the year that I went to university, and that was the first year that more women than men went to university, and every year since then, that's also been the case. But that means that women who were older than me genuinely did have a very different experience of the workplace and of higher education. So I think there's geographical differences, I think there's generational differences, and most important of all, I think there are social class differences. And I think it was Eszter and Alison were making the point that for the middle class women who dominate the media narrative nowadays, many of them are dependent upon cleaners, child carers, people who are working in shops, and it's women who are doing those jobs whose experiences often don't get heard. And my concern with feminism today is not only does it overlook social class as a difference, but it actually, even worse, I think, it often exploits the disadvantages which are faced by working class women to reinforce the privileges of middle class women, and I think that's a completely despicable and outrageous thing to do. So if you look particularly at discussion around the gender pay gap, for example, you have often a small elite group of women. If you take, for example, the BBC presenters who were in the news not that long ago, people who are earning already very, very high salaries, able to present themselves as victims on the assumption that all women together are a class with interests in common, and actually that's just not true. Women have so many different experiences, and yet we hear one voice dominating, where one small group can present themselves as uniquely disadvantaged in a way that just doesn't stand up to reality.
Thank you. I also am very interested in this question of is the issue structural or is it cultural? What's happening there? Because it's the cultural question that seems to dominate. But yes, do you want to come back?
Yes, basically I can relate to both of you, to Joanna and Alison, on this also from East Central European perspective. If we speak about the inequality, growing inequalities between women, if we speak about the middle class women here relying on the work of less privileged women, so there is also it also has this power dimension between core countries and semi-periphery and periphery. So there is a huge literature on the global care chains. So how so our countries in East Central Europe are also sending countries and receiving countries. So we Ukrainians and Romanians come to us and care for our parents. We go to Austria, to Great Britain to care for your parents and do the domestic work there. And 70% of those who do domestic work have children at home. So they leave their own children to care. And of course, one can say, oh yes, but the Philippines. It's so good for the economy that all those women come to the developed West to care here, and it's good for their economy, but it has a lot of costs also in emotional terms. That's why, and connecting to one of the questions, I think, was also about this pop feminism and also how companies exploit that it is now so fancy, and apparently you can sell products with that. And I'm always very cautious when feminists are posting touching videos with empowering messages of companies, how it's important that we acknowledge women. And one shoe company had a huge spot on this, and then we know that company in the South Asia, how they treat their female workers there. So predominantly women work in those factories. So it's I think this global perspective helps us to situate. So my answer to your question is, and which comes up all the time, that it's we need to see the structural and not the cultural. If we remain at this cultural level, then we can just then we have this war between men and women. Then we say, you should change the diapers, you should stop harassing me, and as if all these questions were not embedded in a bigger structure, which create that room of maneuvering for the individuals in their lives, in how they relate to labor market, to care, to each other.
Thank you.
Okay, well, people raised a huge number of interesting points, but so I'll just sort of comment on a couple of them quickly. The first is that, following from what Eszter was saying about the marketing, people will go where they think there is a market. If there is a marketing opportunity, they will take it. And I think, I don't know whether this counts as a structural thing or not. Most marketing departments are dominated by women. They're marketers first and women second, I would say. And that is a reality about, particularly about our societies, because they are capitalist. But it goes back, I suppose, to my slightly, I thought it was particularly negative, but my constant plea that we look at where people's individual interests are, because they will always inevitably be the first thing, though not necessarily the only thing. And that actually that's the second point I want to make, which is about feminism being elitist. And of course, you're absolutely right. In some sense, it's always been elitist, because the movements that have an impact on how we see the world, and indeed on the laws that we've passed, are always led by a small group of people, and they tend inevitably to be people who are educated, who have the means, who have the reach to have an impact nationally, whatever their origins. But I do actually think that feminism used to be less self-regarding and less elite-focused than it has become. I mean, much, much less. And my personal number one heroine, actually, is Eleanor Rathbone, who I suspect most people have never, who here has ever heard of Eleanor Rathbone? Well, I'm not surprised I hadn't heard of her for a very long time, but she was utterly extraordinary. She was pre-war. She created child benefit. She actually banged away at the British establishment until they created child benefit. And the important thing about child benefit was that this was a time when you got money for each child, and it went to the mother. And that was absolutely critical. Two things were critical. First, that she actually got this benefit in days long before the whole welfare state swept out. And secondly, that she insisted, at a period when most women did not work, that it go to the mother, that it was money for the mother. And I think that she was a perfect example of feminism in a world where I think the problems facing women were far greater and overwhelming, and of course they were bound up with more general poverty. But I think the feminists of that very early generation were much, much less concerned than later groups with their own self-interest, and much more concerned with what were then genuinely huge gender-linked inequalities in society. So I think you're right, feminism has always been to some extent elitist, but I think it's become much, much more so.
Okay, back over to you.
Hello. Hi. So, Eszter, right? You mentioned about Hungary, so it's just got me thinking, is there a difference of feminism in the West compared to other parts of the world? Because obviously in the West we have problems like manspreading and mansplaining, whereas somewhere like Saudi Arabia or India there's child marriages, and like, you get what I'm trying to say. So should feminists be focused on men spreading their legs in the train more than, 12-year-olds getting married off into 60-year-old people? So do you think feminists should actually refocus on what's important rather than, oh, I can kind of make the shape of your genitals?
So that's very interesting, and you've all clapped there. It's not important that manspreading is not important. So are these things just not, it seems like the panel, in a sense, are just saying, oh, there's bigger problems, why are we worried about that? What's all the fuss? Everyone's just got common sense anyway, But so it's not just, I take the point about the Financial Times, but it's not just the big newspapers. This is all over social media. And the point about social media is that that's supposed to be us. As Helena said, that is supposed to be the people, in a sense, having their say. So I would really like to get a bit of a sense of what you think about this question. Is it just elite, and does it matter?
Hello, yes. I work in engineering software, so that's engineering, old industry, software, new industry, so it's quite an interesting dynamic going on in there. At my company, they have lean-in circles, and I've always been interested to know why I work with a team of 20 guys writing software and there are no women. They think they're quite diverse, because yes, we have people from Romania, Bulgaria, India, wherever. But anyway, I'm genuinely interested to know, I've always been interested to know why aren't women coming into the software side more. So I go along to the lean-in circles, just to talk to people, find out, their real experiences, why they think this isn't happening, why there aren't more women in software. And incidentally, 20 or 30 years ago, there were more. I think it's gone down, at least in the area I work on. But what gets me is, invariably, we do have discussions about, is it James Damore, the Google guy? But a lot of the time they want to talk about unconscious bias, which I feel quite uncomfortable with, and I try and push it, but I seriously get pushed back on why do you think it's not important. Anyway, so I'm interested to know what the panel thinks of that. There's also an anecdote that was on The Engineer this week. There was a young woman who's an engineer doing outreach work. I think it was for Brompton Bicycles. They got a bunch of young women along, I guess they were about 14, and it took her ages to get them to ask questions. And she was hoping they're going to ask questions like, what's your job like? How do you design this? Whatever. And she was horrified, and I was horrified, because what they actually asked was, how do you deal with all the bullying in the innuendo, etc., etc.? They weren't interested in the engineering. And this ties in a bit to the social media thing, I guess. I'd just like to know where these young women have got these things where that is the first question they ask in a particular profession, about a particular profession.
Hi, I'm Diana Fleischman. I'm just interested in the influence of mate choice and status. So overall, women around the world, they tend to choose men who are older than them, and they tend to choose men who are making more money than them. And this has been found to be a force in inequality in France, so that women tend to marry men who are wealthier and who are higher status is a major issue. Because if two people are trying to decide who's going to stay home and take care of the kids, then the person who makes more money is going to necessarily try and stay at work, and the woman makes less money, and who's necessarily younger is going to potentially stay at home. And one problem, I think, is that feminism has been speaking to women in the language of status, and women are less status-driven than men are. When they are left to their own choices, they tend to prefer to stay home with their family more than men do. And so one thing that I think feminism hasn't really thought about is increasing the status of stay-at-home dads, or telling women, if you want to have a job, if you want to be out in the workforce, and if you want to be high status yourself, you should choose a man who's happy to be a stay-at-home dad. Why haven't we decided to say, men who are stay-at-home dads, you have the status of CEOs, and you are real heroes in our societies?
Great.
I think the interesting thing about, sort of the talk about feminism being quite elitist, what interests me is actually when you look at a clear-cut case of actually actual victims from a particular group. I'm talking about, particularly, say, if you look at, say, Rotherham, where you've got, obviously, a huge number of girls who've been abused, and our inability to actually tackle that. And so much of it was, so much of the debate around it surrounded actually trying to silence people, because it's not just about feminism, it's about the whole sort of progressive stack that you've got going on at the moment. So who you are, what's happened to you. So even when you've got a clear-cut case of a victim, when I've actually had to go out of my way to try and find out some of the facts of the cases of what's actually happened in those things, because it's not being reported in the same way that something like manspreading is or whatever, because it's uncomfortable. And another thing is when you're talking about silencing, actually I feel like a lot more women have been silenced over an issue like that. And it's like, no, well, you can't talk about it because it's too many different things going on there. So yeah, I do think it's elitist, and I do think it's interesting to see which voices get heard and which voices are actually allowed to speak and on which issues.
Thanks. Two quick points. In the spirit of self-disclosure, I should probably say that I've been the chief executive of a charity, British Pregnancy Advisory Service, that provides abortion services for 13 years. And I've got a board which is predominantly female. I've got a senior management team that's predominantly female. And I have to say my experience of working with both the board members and the senior management team, who've changed over the time that I've been there, is that their progressiveness and their response to issues has had nothing to do with their gender and everything to do with their values and their attitudes and their beliefs. And the guys that we've had in those positions have actually been as progressive as the women, and as pro-women's rights and as pro-choice. And sometimes even, I kind of hesitate to say this, but even sometimes a little bit easier to get on some of the edgy issues, because they've had to kind of struggle with getting to the point. They're not just thinking about themselves. They've had to think about what's important about, say, being pro-choice from a political point of view, not just about what might happen if they got pregnant. So there's a thing there that I just wonder how you think about. But what I really wanted to pick up on was the point that Alison was making about the difference in the kind of different level of issues that get raised, because this is really hard to cope with as an employer even, because what happens, I think, is that, and politically, you know, there are certain things that are susceptible to a social solution, like wages and working conditions and childcare and stuff. And then I sometimes feel a bit old-fashioned, because I think that there are certain things which we can say are part of a systemic thing, but I kind of think they're only susceptible to a personal response. And I kind of wonder sometimes that thinking that somebody has to do something almost makes us more passive. So I'm thinking that when I was 17 and got my first Saturday job as a waitress, and the boss came up behind me when I was doing the washing up and put his hands on my breasts, all I could do was turn around and thump him, because actually there wasn't anybody that you could appeal to. So I kind of think that's sort of what we did. So, you know, a guy who's manspreading, you say, put your legs together, please, so I can sit down. Do you know what I mean? And there's a certain kind of thing that we don't do that anymore. We tweet about it. And so I just wonder whether that loss of perspective in that's something that you have to deal with on an individual level because politics can't, is an outcome of what you're saying, that everything gets made political, so we lose the distinction. I don't know, it's a question.
Yes, this is a question as well. It's not something that I have any authority on or anything, but I'm quite surprised that no one's mentioned about what goes on in schools these days and how young girls are kind of led to think it's okay to send their photo naked, which ends up all over the internet, etc., etc. The rap culture, which is quite relatively new. I mean, all these things didn't really go on when I was a kid. At least I wasn't aware of them. And of course, all the very violent sex that is on the internet that informs young people. And is that a backlash? I mean, it's a question. Is it a backlash against, because some women, elitist women, have gained so much power? So is that a male backlash? I don't know. I mean, it's just a question.
I was wondering if any of the panelists would describe themselves as feminists. I'm a young millennial woman, and I'm finding it increasingly hard to describe myself as a feminist. So I'd be really interested in to know what you guys have to say about that. And quickly, I was recently having a conversation with a male colleague, and we were talking about this trend that we seem to be seeing recently, more in London than anywhere else in the UK, about banning adverts. And last week, I don't know if anyone else saw it, but an advert of Gary Lineker had been banned on the Underground because he was topless. And I showed it to my male colleague, and he was like, oh, that's absurd, that's ridiculous. And we had a giggle about it. And I said, it's almost as absurd as that time where they banned a woman in a bikini from the Underground. And he said, oh, no, that's completely fair enough. And I was shocked and angry and quite disgusted. And I was wondering if the panelists thought this was maybe a new type of sexism that we're seeing. It's being paraded about and it's being camouflaged as progressive, but it is ultimately sexist because he saw me as different to him because I'm a woman and I therefore am apparently weaker. I can't handle it. So I was wondering if the panelists maybe thought there was a new form of sexism, a new breed of sexism.
Thank you.
But yeah, you brought up the issue of the inequality between mothers and fathers in the labour force. And what I was wondering is, so from an economic standpoint, how could the inequality of mothers in high-paying jobs be reduced without slowing economic productivity?
Just a couple of those. And on the unconscious bias issue, because I think this is becoming a much bigger feature of workplaces nowadays. My problem with the concept of unconscious bias is it suggests that when you advertise a position in a tech company, you have hundreds of women applying, and then the people who are sitting on the interview panel have this unconscious bias and so deliberately reject or not deliberately, but unconsciously reject all of these women. Actually, if you have a look at the figures, it is the case that fewer women are applying in the first place. And obviously, you can't be unconsciously biased about people who don't apply in the first place. What concerns me is the point that you raised, which is absolutely spot on, about the numbers of women in some science, some tech industries actually going down. And my real fear is that some of the lessons of feminism become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So when girls from their earliest days in school see that they are the target of special campaigns to get them into science subjects, because it's so difficult, there will be so many barriers for you, you need to have these special classes so we can mentor you and help you. Actually, the message that they get is working in tech or working in science is something really difficult, and there are going to be so many obstacles. And I think if they take that lesson on board, then they do think, well, that's obviously not somewhere that's going to be welcoming for me. So I think feminism can score a serious own goal in that regard. I also wanted to come back on this issue about, is it just down to the individual woman to slap the man across the face, or to kind of work out our own solutions to these problems? Because I think there's a bit of a halfway house on that one, particularly thinking about the issue of childcare and nursery provision. I think, you can see how we could have more state support, we could have campaigns for cheaper childcare, and that's definitely something I'd support. I think childcare is far too expensive in this country. But whilst at the same time we have a culture that tells us that, whatever happens to the child in the first year of their life will determine their entire future. And if you're a good mother, you don't let your child walk home from school alone. You must be there filling every hour of every day of your child's day with kind of meaningful and constructive activities. Then it doesn't really matter how many nurseries we have or how many after-school clubs we have, how expensive or cheap they are. If that cultural pressure is on you to do something else, to be with your child, then that makes it harder, I think, for women to leave their children in nurseries and to go to work. Finally, very, very quick point on the sexting thing. I think that's a really interesting issue, and we could almost have another session to explore that, but just very quick comment. My concern with the sexting is that girls and boys are engaging in sending sexts rather than having proper relationships, proper human interaction with each other. So they're in their bedroom on their own with the mobile phone rather than talking to the boy next door in real life. And it actually makes more barriers between the sexes rather than helping people grow up alongside each other and learn that boys and girls are actually not anything special.
So I'd like to pick up, first of all, on the stay-at-home dad point, because I think that's a really interesting one. My husband is a stay-at-home father and has been since we had our fourth child. He was a financial journalist before, and he wanted to stay at home and spend more time with our children. We now have 9 children. That is the final end tally. Actually, I should just emphasize that. I'm going to be a granny in 2 months' time, which is slightly daunting for us. But anyways, but he has also contributed. He's a very private person, didn't want to kind of share his story too much, but he has contributed to what I've written in the book, and he's talked about the status issue and how difficult it is. He thinks, generously, he says it's not just for dads, but actually stay-at-home mums as well, that often, put a lot of pressure to work, whereas actually, obviously, bringing up the next generation there couldn't be any more important job than that. And I think the logical extension, and it perhaps reflects on or brings together a number of things we've talked about. We've talked about sort of the women issue being from the perspective of the women all the time, or that being our danger zone, that we're looking at it rather selfishly. It's all about us, and understandably, but actually we need to look upon it as from the point of view of our male friends, family, colleagues as well. I think at work I see a lot of men quite frustrated that they feel part of the problem when they're sent off on unconscious bias training, whereas they actually want to be part of the solution. So I think it's part of a broader, I think one of the things about all of this is we've got to widen it, not just to be feminism for feminism's sake, but actually about what kind of society do we want to live in, what kind of society can we live in with changes, and perhaps more men to have more choice, not to feel compelled to be the kind of alpha male that many of them don't want to be, my husband assures me. There are lots of other interesting points. The only other one I was going to sort of try to pick up on, I don't think we can legislate how people think. And, well, I know we can't legislate how people think. We can legislate how they might behave or sort of put barriers behind that, and that can change the way they think over time. But I do think we need to recognise the fact this is a hearts and minds issue. I have personally, last point, in case I don't get back on the stages, I have personally wrestled with, am I wrong to focus on a part where I know more about, which is around, women in leadership positions in business and so forth. And I spoke a little while ago at something which was entitled, "What Would You Do to Change the World for Women?" And they had people who were talking about the situation in India, who were leading on pay inequality and were leading on what's happening in Saudi Arabia and so forth. And actually I came to the conclusion that, again, it's like a patchwork quilt where we won't continue to make progress in Western societies unless we set the standard, but we mustn't forget the position that we're in and how we might be able to help in other areas as well. So I just wanted to say that.
First, to the question of whether we need other type of feminism and dealing with other problems than male spreading and these issues, especially in our country. So what I would bring in the concept of Alexander Kiosev, who is a Bulgarian theoretician who coined the term self-colonization, meaning that our region didn't need to be colonized. The elites did it for themselves in these cultural terms, that this narrative about ourselves, that we are backward, we need to catch up with the developed West, are we already progressive enough in our values and culture? And this is a bit behind all this thing, how we import things from the developed West, and including the language and the problems, which are not necessarily rooted, or it's not what the Hungarian women would say in the first 20 or 100 places, what are their problems in life. So one example to bring in is this, the prostitution, sex work debate. And Hungary is one of the major sending countries in human trafficking towards Germany, Switzerland, Netherlands, and there are very poor regions in Hungary where very poor women don't have another choice to provide for their children. And then in this context, where women are trafficked or women are extremely poor, speaking about, and we are importing now this narrative of the whole problem with prostitution, that it's stigmatized, and we should speak about it as a free choice, and that would solve the problem of the prostitutes in Hungary, and it is so outrageous that it changes the focus completely of the debate and of the policy recommendations and all those things. So if I am asked if I'm a feminist, then I would say definitely yes. But I have to add many things. Yes, but I'm not this type, that type, that type, that type. And in the end, defining it in a negative terms, that please don't mistake me for this type of feminism. So I think it is very difficult to articulate the real issues of real women and consider also this class perspectives, what we have already brought up, and in a country where the huge problems are with access to contraception, with all this discourse about you should have children, you are a woman, so that's your main task, but once the child is there, then you just don't get the support from state, from communities, from employer. So of course there's a big question who should regulate on that, and I really don't think it's enough to persuade men that they take their fair share, as what I already mentioned, that families often do not have the choice if the only secure job in the family is the job of the man. Then it's not only about how we who will change the diapers if that is constraints. Mm-hmm.
I don't describe myself as a feminist anymore, and the reason I don't is because because we're human, we're constantly sending out signals to people about the sort of person that we are. You can't avoid it, there's nothing you can do about it. But these days, to say voluntarily, I am a feminist, as one of the sort of self-descriptors that you choose, is to also identify with a certain set of values and priorities which are not mine. And so I don't anymore. And this also comes back to one of the first comments. I mean, one of the things that really distresses me about British feminism is not just that it hasn't been concerned with child marriage in South Asia, it hasn't been concerned with forced marriage in the United Kingdom. And I think that is something that both voluntary self-described feminists should be ashamed of, but also all the rest of us should be ashamed of it too. That it should have become much more of an issue and should be much more of an issue than it is, and people just don't want to go there, and that is shameful. The second thing is on the question of why are there now so many fewer people fewer women in software? Because actually, as you said, what is so curious is that in the early days there were masses. There was this amazing woman, Steve Smith, who basically made a fortune using part-time women who often had maths degrees and who were fantastic programmers. And I've had this conversation with a number of people because it is a real mystery. And I think part of it, I mean, Joanna, you're right. I mean, that the supposed remedy probably makes it worse. But I do also think it's to do with the different structures of most men and women's lives, because I've really thought about this. You kind of have to stay up to date in software. You can't take a few years out very easily and come back very easily, I don't think. And what you can see with women is that they quite sensibly tend to move towards professional jobs which have a certain security attached to them and which also have some potential of part-time work. Now, that's not universal. I mean, the city is a nightmare, for example. You can't just say, well, you know, I'm going to just do it on shifts. But it is very striking, and I think that I don't think the main problem is the unconscious bias of the software industry. I really don't. I think the problem is that women now have many more opportunities, and because, although some of them may be quite clear they're going to work full-time all their lives and never stop, many of them do think in terms of taking breaks. And when you're thinking that way, there are many other occupations which are friendlier, and I can see this myself. I mean, why did I become an academic? Well, in part because although you work all the time, you actually have remarkable freedom about when and where you work. So you can basically not have to be somewhere from 8 till 6 and not move. So there are, I think, structural differences. And that brings me to the third thing about why do so few of us choose to or find husbands, fathers, us as in women, fathers for our children who want to be the main stay-at-home person. And I did think about this really hard, actually, when I was writing this book, because there's been far less movement towards it than one would have thought possible. And I think it is because, although some people are fortunate enough, like Helen and like my friend, another Helen who's in the book, you marry somebody and it turns out that actually that works out. It doesn't make sense for primate females to look for mates who are actually less talented, less energetic, less committed, just lazier than they are themselves. And I actually came to the conclusion this was part of the problem. That doesn't mean we couldn't make it much easier for men to be the ones who decide to take a break. But I think that I always used to think that would be what would happen, and it didn't, and so I started to wonder about it. And finally, yes, you're absolutely right. There is so much that you just cannot fix through political activity. I mean, you just can't. And you come back to the values of the society. And that's a whole other discussion.
I've got to say, in my husband's defence, it's not a lazy man's option.
No, exactly, no.
Children.
No,
I mean, sometimes I skip off to work quite
But you have
happily.
9, no. But I'm actually quoting a couple of other people I spoke to about this, I mean, who said, you know, but they were sure there were lots of people who would have been happy to live off them, and they weren't doing that.
Yeah, great.
No.
Okay, there's a few more minutes left, not very long, for final points and questions from you. Then I'll bring my panel in for their final remarks.
One of the things that often brings the elitism of feminism into sharp relief for me is when you get headlines about offensive items of clothing, such as pink T-shirts that say Daddy's Little Girl or princessy shoes. And I would have thought that logically the strongest way to protest those is to simply not buy them. And yet there's often calls from feminists to just ban those items. And my impression is that often the items are on sale in places like Eszter and Tesco's. And the women calling to ban them, I think, my perception is that those aren't the places that they shop. They're more likely to shop at John Lewis and Bowden. So it sort of feels like they don't trust
other women, working class women, women from low income families, to make their own decisions and to make their own choices. And it worries me that that's a sense of paternalism that's becoming more and more deeply ingrained within modern feminism.
Hi. Sorry, first of all, my understanding of what a feminist is somebody who believes that women are equal to men. So on that basis, I find it strange that you wouldn't identify perhaps as a feminist. I'm a primary school teacher, and what my friend here, who's also primary, what we see is issues of gender stereotyping, little seeds that are fed, which ties into what you just said. But I recently did a PSHE lesson on gender stereotyping, and the first thing I did was I put girl on one side of the board and boy on the other, and I asked the pupils to say what words came into their head. And obviously with boys, strong, sporty; with girls, sassy, makeup, glitter, princess. And then we went on to look at the Clark's shoes that came over in the summer. The girls' range that was Dolly Babe, and the boys' that was Leader. And my class of children are hugely wide and varied in ethnicity, in religion, and in class, and they were all enraged, including the boys. And I'm not really sure what my point is, other than whether this is elitism and feminism, then perhaps what we need to be thinking about is how we address these things from a very young age.
Hi, science teacher in secondary and also STEM representative. In response to many points that have been made, I think you're absolutely 100% right. I put so much effort into trying to get young ladies to come to STEM Club, but quite frankly, they just aren't interested. I think, I don't have the data in front of me, but it's less than 0.2% increase over the last 20 years in uptake of young ladies wanting to pursue STEM provided facilities for them. Now, I think part of the reason for this is that everyone wants to be popular, successful, have recognition, and a male who is popular, successful, and is recognised for that, is successful in the workplace, successful with women, has a nice car job, etc., like that. And I think with the girls, why would they want to pursue science unless they're genuinely interested? Yes, I have some young ladies, they are very interested in science, that's what they want to do. So of course, they come along to STEM Club, of course they do. But the others, they want to be popular, they want to be recognised by their peers, and unfortunately, with this sort of curse that is social media and likes and that kind of thing, their quickest route to that recognition is through focusing on makeup. So that is naturally the route that they go down. On another point,
Okay, sorry, we haven't got...
Can I take 10 seconds? I would just say that, is it not recognition that we have come so far that I can make a statement in the workplace or something like that without thinking whether that's appropriate for women or men? I don't concern myself with if I'm going to offend someone. How can we roll that success out to the rest of the world? Because without World War I, Spanish influenza, and World War II wiping out a third of the male population to give women the ability, although, how are we going to do that for the rest of the world?
As everyone would have noticed, there's been an upsurge in identity politics. And in reaction to that, there's been a lot of people who've criticized that trend, saying it's a form of victimhood Olympics, so to speak. So on that note, I'd like to ask the panel what their thinking is in respect with feminism to do with the idea of universalism against identity politics.
Hi, to this primary school teacher who has talked about gender stereotyping. It's weird, but with gender stereotyping, it seems like now being a girl and being interested in typically girly stuff like makeup and stuff, it's now a bad thing. You can't, if you're a girl and you're interested in makeup, I'm interested in makeup and clothes, but I'm also interested in coding and science and stuff. But why can't I do both? And why is that a bad thing? And so it's almost like girls no longer, it's telling girls that you cannot be interested in makeup and interested in science. And it's weird that that's a problem. And now it's also almost as if people are making it a problem to be interested in makeup and girl stuff, which is weird to me anyway.
I'm going to bring my speakers back in reverse order, if that's okay, to start with you. So just to sum up then, if you can give your final remarks.
Well, I can't respond to all the very interesting points that were made, so I'm going to come back to shoes. Pink and blue shoes. I think the pink and blue thing drives me nuts, but I have to say I think it is a creation of the marketers who've realised that we're rich enough that we can probably afford to buy one of each in most cases, because it's much, much worse than it used to be, and it's much worse the richer the country. But it does come back to the final point about, why do we feel that in order to be equal in the workplace, in order to have equality in schools, we have to wipe out all gender difference. I think that's a completely useless thing to try and do. You can't do it. And maybe if we stop trying to wipe it out and stop trying to judge our success in life by how many girls become bricklayers, we might actually, oddly enough, make more progress to societies that are better for everybody. I mean,
I would answer only 2 points, or try to give my ideas. One is I'm a bit always nervous when we speak about STEM jobs and how we attract women to STEM jobs, and that if we have a bigger share, then it will be a more equal world, that because then we combated stereotypes. But I'm really not, again, I'm a feminist, but not that type of feminist who wants to educate people on how to make their choices. Of course, I know the choices are embedded and so on, but I'm also more interested in creating rooms where no matter what they choose as a profession, they are not disadvantaged in life, or they are not worse paid. So even those jobs should exactly be paid, those which are performed predominantly by women. And then if they are also have the same value, then men might go also there, then it would be a bit more free and not being obsessed with stereotypes. That's how I see. And then the last question, on universalism and identity politics, I agree also on the fact that this oppression Olympics is not the way forward. And my main point on that is that it brings down structural problems to the individual level. So if all this narrative about check your privileges and me as a white feminist, but okay, I'm East European, so I have a good, I'm a woman and from Eastern Europe, so I have already 2 points which qualify me to speak about certain issues. It's really a very strange thing, but I think also with this that I wouldn't blame those people alone defending this type of activism. I think we also have to see how this type of activism is embedded in this economic trend which encourages individual solutions and depoliticizes issues and works against universalist narratives. So that's where we have to set in. Thanks.
So first I wanted to say I think it's been a really great conversation, and to thank the audience for all the points that you have raised. I think it's shown that where we've made progress, the approach isn't quite working, and that we need to reassess. I'm 51 years old, and to succeed in my career, I really have had to play by the rules, whereas now I feel really confident that my daughters, I have 6 daughters, 3 sons, neither will have to be the same as their brothers to be as good as their brothers, and they will be able to help, along with you, to reinvent the rules. I would like to pick up on the point, and for closing, that that we should be less judgmental of each other. I think diversity ultimately is less about squeezing us all into, well, obviously it's completely not about making us all the same. It's about valuing our differences. And I think living and letting live, being more open to other ideas, which is all about the battle ideas, is the only way really that we can come up with solutions to the many problems that we have. So thank you.
Just very quickly, I wanted to come back on the point here about the definition of feminism, because I have lost track of a number of times I've been told over the past 3 years that I need to get a dictionary and look up the meaning of feminism, because doesn't it just mean men and women are equal, and so, or a belief that men and women can be equal, and therefore, of course, I am a feminist. And I wish that was the case. I wish that was what feminism meant nowadays, but it doesn't. And I would come back to the person who made the point over here, who was asking the question, would we on the panel describe ourselves as a feminist? And isn't it the case that feminism nowadays can actually be quite sexist? I would completely agree with that. I think some of the biggest examples of misogyny I see nowadays, ironically, come from feminism. The argument that women need looking after, need protecting, need putting on a pedestal. We need adverts taken away from us. We need song lyrics banned. We need social media to be monitored and restricted for our benefit. I think this presentation of women as these kind of vulnerable little flowers is really nauseating and does not do women any favours whatsoever. The only thing I think is equally as bad, to come back to the question on identity politics, is when you then get the response that, oh, actually, it's so much worse for men as well. And you get this competing narrative, oh, no, we have it worse. Oh, no, we have it worse. And that does no one any favours whatsoever. So, no, I wouldn't call myself a feminist nowadays. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.